Okay, welcome back. Hope you had a good little break. We are in Isaiah 53, and we're going to come back right through and read the rest of this together. Let's say it again. In fact, in verse 4, I want to go over that again. In verse 6, we all like sheep went astray. We turned each one to his own way. I want you to think about that, okay? I want you to think about that very hard, because that right there is the crux of the problem that we face in reconciling our own behavior, our own conscience, our own understanding of what God wants and doesn't want. Is couched in that. We're going to come back to it. So let's finish reading the entire section here. Again, it says, although he had done no violence and had said nothing deceptive, he told no lies, it pleased the Lord to crush him with illness, to see if he would present himself as a guilt offering. And if he does, he will see his offspring, and he will prolong his days, and at his hand Adonai's desire will be accomplished. After this ordeal, he will see satisfaction, and by his knowing, by his pain and sacrifice, my righteous servant makes many righteous. It is for their sins that he suffers. Therefore, I will assign him a share with the great, and he will divide the spoil with the mighty, for having exposed himself to death and being counted among the sinners, while actually bearing the sin of many and interceding for the offenders. Well, let me tell you, nothing has sparked controversy within Judaism for the last 1,000 years or more than that. That's what folks use as proof of the suffering servant Yeshua and what Jesus went through. And he went through all of this. But the rabbis will tell you, and I've read almost everything that they have to say about it, and their take is once again from a non-spiritual viewpoint, but only a physical viewpoint, to see they're looking, and we're looking, for a salvation to save them from the atrocities of mankind and tribulation and being this, that, and the third. Well, they're in the land now, okay, and still have not heard, okay? Well, listen, what he's saying is that they say that this is Israel, that the suffering servant is Israel itself, when it doesn't say that. It says, I will assign him a share with the great. Him, okay? Period. Very simple. He will divide the spoil with the mighty. He expressed himself to death and was counted among the sinners. So we see this, and, you know, as I said before, a prophet sees the end of man in themselves. We can see that Paul as well sees this nature in us, okay? The problem is that we and they decide, they insist on drawing up our own moral code instead of following the one that's been given to us, prescribed full, end to end. And it's not severe, okay? But we don't. So we look at this suffering servant, and we say, and interestingly enough, in many discussions in Judaism, they leave the chapter out. It's too telling, and they dance and dance and dance around it to no one's satisfaction. Every conjecture, every commentary that I've read, and I've read dozens and dozens, all right, comes nowhere close. And let's look at 52, Isaiah 52, right before it, right? Just before 53, in verse 7 and 8 of 52. Listen to what it says. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, proclaiming peace, bringing good news of good things, and announcing salvation, and saying to Zion, your God is king. Listen, your watchmen are raising their voices, shouting for joy together, for they will see before their own eyes the Lord returning to Zion. That's right before chapter 53, which the Jewish community rejects. as being the Messiah. They don't get it, that there's a physical saving and a spiritual as well. There is the Messiah, the suffering servant, the Moshiach ben Joseph, all right? The Messiah, the anointed one that enlarges, okay? Joseph means enlarger of the people. And there was Melchizedek, the high priest. So, yes, those are manifestations of God as the Messiah. Why? Well, because Melchizedek means king of righteousness in the city of peace, which is Salem, Jerusalem, okay? And he came, and Yeshua was called, as we read in Hebrews, in our study on Hebrews, a high priest after the order, forever, after the order of Melchizedek, okay? So you have the high priest. Then at the Passover, you have the Messiah, who's the suffering servant, who was slaughtered like a lamb. So you have the high priest who administers, okay, the sacrifice, Yeshua, the Messiah ben Joseph. Why? So he can be resurrected on the Feast of First Fruits 3 days later. And as he said to his disciples, I will come to you. I will send you a comforter. Do not be dismayed. He says, I'll come to you myself. Comfort is the Holy Spirit. That's the Spirit of God. So when we're transfigured fully and into the God sense of things, everywhere is God, okay? He says, I'll come to you myself. Well, guess what? 49 weeks later, 50 weeks, they say, but it's actually 7 weeks. 7 days, 49 weeks. All right, 49 days, rather. That's what we're going to talk about on Shavuot next week and the following week after that. But let's just be mindful of exactly that. Oh, by the way, to go back yet again, back to the Sukkot and the living waters, well, we talked about that. I thought that would be a day, an appointed time for the return of Messiah, based on every other scriptural appearance that the Messiah had, Yeshua had. It's funny that the rabbis colloquially referred to Shmini Atzeret, the Festival of Living Waters, which we're going to talk about again and again, as waiting for the return of an old friend. Well, interesting. There's a lot going on. There's going to be very intense the next 2 weeks, but we want to go ahead and get through and just talk a little bit more about Isaiah 53. Okay? When in the Hebrew, he talks about that he would be despised and oppressed and killed, even though he did nothing wrong. And the purpose of his suffering was, quote, in Isaiah 53:9, to startle many nations, is what it really says, to startle many nations, startle them, all right, what? Out of their stupor, okay? Startling the nations is what it's referred to as. In the Hebrew, the word yazeh can be translated as startle or sprinkle, okay? He was the suffering servant. And the more accurate translation of that is sprinkle. That's the same word used in Leviticus for sprinkling the sacrificial blood. Leviticus 4:6 and 16:14 and 16:19. They indicate that the servant's disfiguring death would function as a sacrifice for many nations. All right? And he was to bear the sorrows and the grief and the iniquities upon himself. And when the people, it's so funny how people look at things in the contrast of what really happened here, all right? In Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 6, he talks about he bore our diseases. That means he took them upon himself, okay? And he took our pain. And yet we regarded him as the one that was being punished when it was us that deserved it, but he took it. Okay? He took it. He's the guy that won the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, and the Medal of Honor all in one battle. All right? He took it all on himself for us, for everything, for everybody, for his team, his whole team. Remember, God was that none would be lost. Okay? and he was wounded for our crimes and iniquities and crushed under the weight of that tree and his death, all right? The bruises were healed. It says he was striped and pierced. Do you ever notice something? Let's go back to the Exodus and the festival of unleavened bread, which basically is matzah. Go get a piece of matzah one day and pull it out of a box, okay? Go to the Jewish section or the Passover section and get a box of matzah. Pick it up. It's flat bread. There's no leaven in it. Why? Because it was the bread of haste, the bread of affliction that they had to escape. They didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise with yeast. Yeast puffeth up, okay? It's the pride of life. This was nothing but just flat dough, all right? But look at it. It's striped and it's pierced. Go look at a piece of matzah. Isn't that amazing? He was pierced for our iniquities, and by his stripes we're healed. This is a recurring emphasis here where the prophet conveys the perennial shock, okay, that of those who seem secure in their own ability to handle and stand alone in life, okay? That's what that statement was for when it said we didn't value him. And in verse 5, we all, like sheep, went astray. Listen, we turned each one to his own way. His own way. Now, I don't care how loud Judaism cries about the suffering servant being the Jewish people, who their suffering bore the iniquities of the nations who persecuted them. Oh, stop. That's not what it's about. Being the chosen people is not it should be a crown of glory, but you were chosen to bring this word, this message to all the world. You didn't do it. Instead, they circled the wagons. Why? Because they didn't trust. They didn't see who came to save them. They didn't see any of it. They were looking past it because they were looking for a national military conqueror, okay? They didn't understand that that was the last lap of the race. The Moshiach ben David, David's son, the king. So they don't see it. And they didn't see it. Okay. In the Midrash Rabbah of Ruth in Judaism, you can look at it in the Sansino edition of the Midrash, states that the fifth interpretation of Ruth 2:14 makes it reference to the Messiah. It says, "Come hither, approach the royal state, and eat of the bread," referring to the bread of royalty, "and dip thy morsel in the vinegar," refers to his sufferings, as it is said, "But he was wounded because of our crimes." Okay? Our crimes. So, as much as they cry and scream, the allusions in their own books, in Judaism's books, and works on understanding the Mishnah, the Talmuds, and the argumentation, all right, they just skirt right past this being the Messiah, being that it could possibly be Yeshua. They don't deny he was around, okay? All right, because historically the rabbis believed that Isaiah 53 did point to a Messiah. In the Sanhedrin 98b, the sages ask, well, what is the Messiah's name? And the rabbi's answer to that question is the great rabbi and commentator, grammarian of the 12th century, Ibn Ezra, okay, he concurs that, quote, "All the heathen shall look to me to see what I shall do to those who pierced the Messiah, the son of Joseph." A final reflection hinting at a second coming for the Messiah is actually found in the Midrash Rabbah on Numbers in 11:2 of the Midrash Rabbah. So in their own documents it says it. Listen to what it says in these ancient Jewish documents. "Like the first Redeemer, so will the final Redeemer be. The first Redeemer was Moses, who appeared to them and then disappeared." They don't get it. All right, the final Redeemer will also appear to them, and then he'll disappear. For he has the leper scholar. He is the leper scholar. As it is written, he hath borne our grief, he hath carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him a leper, smitten of God and afflicted. In speaking of the same passages, Jewish sages also say that he is speaking of the King Messiah, as it is said, but he was wounded for our transgression and bruised for our iniquities. In the Targum of Jonathan, which is a commentary, it states in 52:13, quote, Behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase and be exceeding strong. Even in Jewish mysticism, okay, it's written, Surely our diseases he bore and our pains he carried. That's in the Zohar, section 212a, okay? So none of this is new. There's so much out there, okay? So much out there that points to this Messiah and points to Yeshua. But the battleground is there because they don't understand. They don't understand the language of Trinity. How could there be three gods when God said, I am one, you are three? The misunderstanding, the mistreatment of these scriptures has what the middle walls of partition that have gone up between the Jew and the non-Jew when we're supposed to be together in power, which we will do one day. But listen, in the Middle Ages, the great Rabbi Rashi also, they changed the interpretation of this passage, and they made the new interpretation, the nation of Israel became the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. So that only happened in the Middle Ages, all right, because they had to cover that. Many Christians had been persecuting Jews in the name of Jesus, and that was a huge concern to the rabbis, all right? But that was an insane religious bent, bringing in paganism into a religion that started out clean and pure. You can't mix them. You can't mix them. There's only one faith, okay? So we got to be able to understand these things, and we have to take a look at what's really going on, okay? Because, like it says, if we're going to rely on our own, then we're going to discover that, you know, what was thought and understood to be well-deserved misfortunes of another, like the people were saying, crucify him, crucify him. They were lied to as well. They were really their own, all right, and a discovery of the reality of who we are and that we need saving, all right? Job didn't do anything wrong either. Look what he went through. And in the Middle East, it's a belief. It's a solid belief that, you know, it's like a karma. I don't like that word very much, but it's just colloquial. It's believed that we're stricken because of our failures, our sin, and this is why we are stricken with these things. Okay, like leprosy. Okay, in Leviticus 13 verses 3, 9, and 20, and in the Babylonian Talmud, as we just read in Sanhedrin 98a, he is referred to as a leper. Okay. A leper was, you didn't go near a leper. You didn't want to catch leprosy. They put him in a colony, okay? They put him in a colony. You could see that from Ten Commandments. You could see that from the movie Ben-Hur, where the visitation, you know, was down in a leper colony. Well, he went among the afflicted. He had to. Those are the people that he was healing. Remember, in John it says that we're only touching on the things that he did, all right, throughout his ministry. And it says, if they were to tell them all, they would cover books, volumes and volumes of books just on the works that he did in that 3.5 year ministry that he had. All right, so we're coming now to an understanding. I just really want to again point out that while we see pointing toward the revelation of the Messiah in the book of Revelation way back in Isaiah, and there's plenty more, okay? And then we come to Isaiah 53 and we see who it is. And it's still denied. Israel doesn't see it yet, although there are some folks that do. There was one of their chief rabbis who passed away a few years ago and wrote a book about his secret learning of the Messiah and his proclamation in his book. He passed on, and they didn't know what to do. This is only a couple of years ago, like maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, where he had the experience and he knew and proclaimed that Yeshua, the one Jesus, they called Jesus, was in fact the Messiah. Now, that's from one of the chief rabbis in the world, and that's in the Chabad Lubavitch, the Orthodox, the very ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidim, all right, in that community. And that rabbi, now these people are going like, now what do we do? What are you going to do? Tell a guy was a flake his whole life? You're going to destroy his whole life like we see today? The minute you don't agree with somebody, they cancel you, okay? Well, they ain't going to cancel that guy because he's dead. And he wrote the book, and there's no arguments. That's it. He gave his reasons, and they gave everything else why, and he told everybody what was going on. So there are folks that know and believe, you know what? Because if you really, really, really dedicate yourself to the scriptures, you're going to find these things out, okay? You have to ask yourself these questions. Even folks that are only reading, the first books of the Bible, not the New Covenant. And that's the problem. That's a shame where we have these two testimonies, one for physical Israel and one for spiritual Israel together, and one is a natural progression from one to the next. And this is what God has done. He's shown us with Melchizedek. He showed us with the servant, the lamb and the sacrifice. The high priest actually wound up as the sacrifice and is going to wind up as the king. How about that? Okay? God's not three people in one. The Messiah is. High priest, suffering servant, king, triune Messiah, just like we are. Remember the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. All right? And we in verse 5, Deuteronomy 6:5, you, meaning us, shall worship him with your whole heart, your whole mind, and your whole might or strength. Your heart is your body. Your mind is your soul. And your might is your spirit. God's spirit in you. So he presumes and says that our totality, our wholeness is bound up in us being triune. But until we turn on that acceptance and ask that born-again experience, like Jesus told Nicodemus, birth of water and of the Spirit, we're only living on two levels. We're not even fully human, because that's what God's perception of us as human is. Body, soul, and spirit. The spirit, being what we're made in the image and likeness of God, is the spirit, because God is spirit, but God is also love. That's why we got to ask ourselves, what are we doing? All right? There's a couple of other things that I'd like to point out to you regarding this prophecy of the suffering servant. And it comes from Isaiah 53, verse 12, which I'm going to reread to you now. Listen. It says, and this is the last verse in Isaiah 53, therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Now, how in the name of all that's holy that could be the nation of Israel, I could not tell you. Poured out his soul, was numbered with the transgressors. He was with thieves. Thieves, villains, and scoundrels. Boris Benonov's, local Union 112. All the bad guys. He was considered and put in with them. Crucifixion was reserved for bad guys. And it says he didn't do a doggone thing, and he did nothing to defend himself. He didn't even open his mouth. But like a lamb, he went to the slaughter on behalf of our behalf. Why? Because it says he bore the sins of many, and he made intercession for all of us transgressors. So knowing that, let's take a look at some of the other scriptural references in the New Covenant that lead us right through this process, okay? It says he will be exalted in chapter 53, verse 13, okay? And we see that also in Philippians chapter 2, verse 9. You might want to copy these down for comparison, or go back and, pause this later on. The second one, it says he will be disfigured by suffering. Well, that's Isaiah 52, verses 14, and 53, verses 2. Okay? The first one was Isaiah 52:13, where it says he'll be exalted, and it's repeated. The prophecy there, the fulfillment, was in Philippians 2:9. The fulfillment of the disfiguring by suffering is in Mark chapter 15, which we talked about before, verses 17 and 19. Then the other prophecy within Isaiah 52 and 53 says he will make a blood atonement. Well, we find out, okay, in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 2, that it's fulfilled there. Then it says in Isaiah 53, verses 1 and 3, which we read before, that he will be widely rejected and despised. Okay? Where does it say that in the fulfillment? In John chapter 12, verses 37 and 38. We see the fulfillment of that prophecy in the Gospel of John. Next it says in chapter 53, verses 6 and 8, it says he will be our substitute. Okay? He's going to take the weight for us. And where do we see that fulfilled in the fulfillment of that prophecy? 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. Then it says he will, in chapter 53, verse 7 and 8, that he will voluntarily accept our guilt and punishment upon himself. And the fulfillment of that prophecy is in the book of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 11, and chapter 19, verse 30. And we're not going to read all of these tonight. I want you to read them. It's why I'm going slow. Next one, it says, the prophecy in chapter 53, verse 9, that he will be buried in a rich man's tomb. Wow, that's another one. Israel was buried in a rich man's tomb, or was Jesus of Nazareth buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb? The rich man. And we see the fulfillment of that in John chapter 19, verses 38 through 42. It's all there. Then it says, the prophecy in 53, verses 10 and 11, that he will save us who believe in him. And the fulfillment of that prophecy is in John 3:16 and Acts chapter 16, verse 31. And finally, it says that in chapter 53, verse 12, as we just read, that he will die on behalf of transgressors, us. And the fulfillment of that is in Mark chapter 15, verses 27 and 28, and the Gospel of Luke chapter 22, verse 37. Okay? I think that gives us a rather complete treatment without going into all the commentary. Basically, I've told you how Israel and Judaism have looked at chapter 13. They're bewildered. They can't explain it, so they come up with every cockamamie rationale, none of which leans on the spirituality that was seen prior, okay, to the Middle Ages. The reality of it, where they saw it was a Messiah, that he suffered, that he was a suffering servant of Joseph, the son of Joseph, okay? They saw it. They also alluded, as we saw in Sanhedrin 98b, a second coming, a return, that he would come back as a king. This is totally in line with the reality of what Scripture says, but it's been perverted. Why? Persecution, suffering, attack, tribulation. They had to smooth it over. Otherwise, Judaism would have collapsed under its own weight because they didn't have the buy-in. Okay? But many do. Many do. There's movements all around the world that way. There are many even in Jerusalem and Israel who believe, okay? And it really just takes a closer examination and an admission. But again, the reality of how prophecies were given earlier on in the book of Isaiah all the way out to the book of Revelation, which is the revelation of the Messiah himself, okay? How that happens. And here we are with the suffering servant. Anyway, that's it for this week. We'll see you next week. Be ready. It's going to be an intensive and very enlightening next 2 weeks. So, for he that makes peace in high places, may he make peace for you. God bless till next week. Peace.